going over. Okay. So while this will be more theory driven and more foundational, the other courses you'll be in labs, you'll have labs to complete, as well as you'll have writings, from an academic perspective, but you'll get more of that hands-on approach in those courses. All right. So we've gone over chapter one, operating system fundamentals. We were touching on chapter two. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoints just as a review of some of the content that we've covered for client and server systems. We're just going to go over. So we know that there are three types of operating systems. There are client operating systems. There are server operating systems and standalone operating systems. Here's my first question. When I say standalone operating systems, what am I referring to? And you can type it in the chat if you don't want to speak. Um, Even though I do love the engagement. When it comes to the embedded standalone operating systems, what do I mean by standalone operating systems? And give me an example.
Understand.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Windows 10.
Windows 10 would be a standalone operating system. Does anybody else want to offer something as well? Before
Linux.
I, oh, go ahead.
Linux.
As a standalone operating system,
Linux.
Linux,
Or
Windows,
Linux.
Linux. Okay. Anybody else? And thank you for being bold, Tolalupe, and giving us a response.
Okay.
I'm gonna pull up Notepad very quickly. I like Ann's answer: a system that can operate on one computer. Okay. Notepad. All right. One thing I always want to tell everyone in this course: no answer is the wrong answer. Every answer is an answer that leads you to a path of discovery. Okay. So if you feel like you're shooting in different areas, we will clarify everything. All right. I don't know why that's stretching through the bottom. That's weird. What is that? See, I'm running a lot of stuff in the background. I gotta shut down. Okay, video. Okay. All right. So remember, we said that there are three types of operating systems. Types of operating systems. We can even take it instead of types. Let's say categories. Categories of operating systems. All right. One, two, three. The first category is what I should have said. Um, we have client, oop, client. We have server, and then we have standalone. Okay, standalone. Now, some examples of client operating systems, just like y'all said, are Windows, Mac OS, Linux. You also have Windows Server. You also have Mac OS server operating systems, and you have Linux based server operating systems. But when it comes to standalone, we're talking about embedded technology. So when we're talking about the embedded technology, some examples would be kiosks, not liosks, but kiosks. Okay. Uh, gas station pumps. Okay. Cash registers. Even, even you have embedded technology in cars. Okay. So this is what I mean by embedded technology. Okay. Let me ask another question. So just to get everybody moving in the right direction. Okay. So when it comes to, okay, types of operating systems, we said Mac OS, we said Windows, we said Linux, and there's also Chrome. And there are some other operating systems out there as well, but these are some of the ones that we use most prevalently. Okay. So, my second question is, if that is the case, what are some features of operating systems? Can you tell me some features of operating systems? And you can type it in the chat if you need to. I'm glad my unmute icon came on. Great answers. Y'all got some great answers. One said file allocation or files management. Okay. Two, task switching. Okay, because you can switch tasks. Three. We said memory. Okay, good. Management. Forgot my E. Memory management. Four. What do we all put? Memory management, file allocation. Um, I'll give you another one. We said task switching, or we can also say multitasking. What is going on here? All right. It also provides a user interface. Okay. And some form of process management. Right. Graphical user interface things taking place. One thing we didn't put here, it would be input, output. Sorry. That's the only downside to having large hands. All right, input output management. There's these are some of the things. These are a few of the functions that are associated or features that are associated with operating systems. Okay, good, good, good. All right, so we're going to leave these notes here and we're going to just cover some other content, get back into some of the content that we were talking about. And just, I'm going to quickly run through some of the concepts related to chapter two. Because we were just talking about Windows operating systems. To me, sometimes it feels like a marketing pitch for Windows. Um, Here's a protocol to get to know. IP security. It's associated with VPNs. So that IP security protocol is something you need to know um, moving forward. Windows Server 2008, included and featured and enhanced these features. Hyper-V is one you really want to pay attention to. You had PowerShell Server Manager, read-only domain controller. Remember that in order to have a domain, which is a group of computers, this is the term that we should really understand what is a domain. Domain is a group of computers that are managed by a central. It's just not working today. All right, by a central device. That central device could be a domain controller, which is just another computer that manages everything. Okay. So you'll have and we also talked about this. Oh, I got another question. What is a peer to peer network? And then what is a client server network? These are questions that we're going to answer in the future. Okay. What is a peer-to-peer network? What is a client server network? And it's important that I'm asking it in this way. And I'm asking it because all of this relates here. All right. So your peer-to-peer network has something that's associated with it. A peer-to-peer network will use work groups. Okay. This is one of the things that defines a peer-to-peer network, work groups, and then domains are associated with client server networks. Okay, so work groups are mainly, that's not saying that a client server network can't have work groups, but work groups are mainly associated with peer-to-peer networks and domains are associated with client server networks. And then we'll get into the definition of what it is a little later. I just wanted to give you that tip. All right, moving forward. Oh, so when we said read-only domain controller, it was implemented so that hackers cannot make changes at remote locations to be replicated to the main domain controller at corporate headquarters. Okay. So it was read-only so that changes can't be made, kind of like your ROM chip, the BIOS in the UEFI. And let me go back here when we say input output management, we're going back to something that Anne mentioned, and this was the BIOS slash UEFI. Okay. Because this is really the big point of input output management, that your BIOS manages that. Also, you have the chipset, the the Southbridge chip that manages that as well. Here's some concepts to know. Failover clustering. When you have two or more servers linked together, one server happens to fail, the other server takes over. You have network load balancing, which is where you have multiple servers, and those multiple servers will handle requests as needed. Okay. Hyper-V is associated with allowing multiple operating systems on a computer. Self-healing NTFS, or New Technology Filing System, a utility that runs in the background to correct hard disk problems. You have Server Core, which is a bare bones installation of Windows Server with a limited GUI, graphical user interface. It reduces hacker attacks. You have PowerShell, powerful command line interface, and a scripting language for performing administrative tasks. You said the link for the lecture is going to YouTube Studios. All right, so let me go back in and see if I can fix that. I'll go to that particular video. That's crazy. Let's go here. Wrong one. Why didn't the main video 4 weeks ago where I just uploaded? Oh, because I made it private. Manage videos. That makes sense because I didn't click on the video. Here we go. Here. Yes, I'm going to record. That's not to you because you asked to record it. All right. That's when Tolalupe asked me to record because sometimes I forget. Uh, and we go back to the class. Edit. Don't delete. Did I delete it? Okay, good. Now I'm going to fix this. Link options. I knew it was extra long. I was like, something's not right. There we go. Okay. See if it works now. Okay. Um, okay. And then we have Server Manager, which combines and replaces the manage your server and configure your server. Okay. This is just a graphic that's associated with Windows Server. I don't know why they make it so small. It says that when the person, if I send it to the private, maybe I should do it unlisted. Okay. It said private is for anyone you can share privately. You can invite others to view your private video by entering their email addresses below. Invitees must sign in to the Google account to your part. I'm not trying to do all that. I'll just make it public. I was just trying to have it for the class, but okay. It should be public now. Refresh. That means I would have to put your Google email in there. Get out of that. So I'll stop doing that. All right. Then Windows 8. I'm going to skip through some of this because some of this is, but this concept right here, storage spaces, is very important because it gives you the ability to do what is called mounting. So, say like if you have an external CD, you can mount it to your drive. All right. And DVD images with a double click on an ISO file. So let me show you this very quickly. How to mount a external hard drive images, videos. Sometimes you got to find a short video, and sometimes these videos be all music which I don't like.
It seems like we have a lot of projects, but we don't spread ourselves thin. We really like being what I call.
Hello everyone, how are you doing? This is MD Tech here with another quick tutorial. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to resolve or find your external hard drive on Windows 11 if you try plugging it in and for some reason it's not being detected. So this should hopefully be a pretty straightforward process, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So what I recommend starting with is opening up the search magnifying glass and type in disk management. Best match should come back with create and format hard disk partitions. Go ahead and open that up. Now, for the drive that you're having the problem with, will probably not have any drive letter next to it. It might just be blank, or whatever drive you're having the problem with. So you can generally tell what drive is probably your hard drive based on your capacity size here. And you probably don't want to mess with system reserved either. So it should be a process of elimination here. Again, you should see it on here if it's not being picked up in File Explorer for some reason. And there would probably be no letter next to the name as well. So let's just say that this is our drive, for example. We're going to go right click on the drive we're having the problem with, and you would select change drive letter and paths. There wouldn't be any drive letter in here if it wasn't being detected, so it just would be blank. And you would select the add or change button, and then you would assign the following drive letter. Click on the drop down and you would select the drive letter you want to assign. And then once you're done with that, you go ahead and select OK. And then since some programs that rely on drive letters might not be able to run correctly, do you want to continue? You go ahead and select yes. And then hopefully then your drive would be accessible and available on your computer. You may also want to consider doing a quick format on the drive as well. And that's about it. So pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you do a format on the drive, you're going to be deleting anything that's saved on it. So I do want to put that out there. But pretty straightforward process, guys. Do hope I was able to help you out. And I do look forward to catching you all in the next tutorial. Goodbye.
Most people have no clue that in 2024, the best way to make money with Amazon is not with physical products.
Hello viewers, welcome to IT System Admin and Information Technology Learning tutorial channel for you. Today in this tutorial I am going to show you how to mount a drive to a particular folder in Windows 11 computer. Sometimes it becomes very important for you, so don't forget to watch full video. To mount a drive in a folder, right click on Start menu, click on Disk Management. Here I have two disks, one is disk 0, another one is disk 1. I want to mount this disk 1, that means G drive, into my disk 0 C drive. Right click on your drive, click on change drive letter and path. G drive is selected right now. Now click on add icon here. Mount in the following empty NTFS folder. Now click on browse option here. And where you want to mount this Z drive, I want to mount my Z drive in E drive. Just click on expand icon here. Here I am creating a folder. Click here new folder. Now give a name G. Okay. Now select the drive and click on OK. Now drive letter is selected. Click on OK. If you want to view your mounted drive path, just click on drive path. Look, your mounted drive path is here. I'm going to check minimize file management, open File Explorer, click on this PC, go to E drive. Look, this is my mounted drive, G drive. I can access Z drive from this mounted folder. Double click on it and you can access from the drive from here. This is all for today. Hope this tutorial is helpful for you. Keep watching.
And you may ask yourself, why would you mount a drive? The whole goal of mounting a drive is to create more space on your computer. Let's say you have a computer like mine. I have a MacBook that only has 8 gigabytes of RAM and not a lot of store. I mean, 8 gigabytes of storage space. That sucks. That is not a lot. Sorry for my crude language as an instructor. Not professional, but excuse me. But it's not good. So if you mount a drive, you can get more size on your computer. So it gives you more space. Okay. So um, that's why you would mount it. And then Windows 8.8 and 8.1 gave you the ability to do that, as well as, see, it said it here. Where did it say it? I know it gave you the ability to mount a drive. It might have been the server manager. I think it was 2008, 2012 server. All right. So also the interface changed. People could not stand Windows 8 because Windows 8 had the charms. You had to go up in the corner, or you had to go to the bottom. A lot of people were upset, but they were trying to match the Windows Phone technology, which did not last long as well. So I'm just going to list the different types of servers, and then we'll get into chapter module 3. So you had Windows Server 12, okay, 2012. Then we went and NTFS was updated. We had Server Manager as well that was updated. Active Directory is very important to know about this. Like I said, there are a lot of positions that are associated with Active Directory. Every time someone is onboarded and offboarded, you'll be working in Active Directory. Not only that, you'll be working in databases, you'll be working in folders, or what we call organizational units, and you'll be setting up policies, group policies, permissions, and all of that within Active Directory. These are some of the features of Windows Server 2012. You have the REFS, which is the other filing system, the server filing system associated with Windows devices. You have your dynamic access control, PowerShell storage spaces, Hyper-V, which is for virtualization, and minimal server interface, just a small graphical user interface, and Server Cone. Which OS was the first operating system that required active installation? I'm just going to run through it real quick. It was Windows XP. You know what's crazy? When you apply for some federal positions and you apply for a cyber position, they will make you take an exam, and some of the exams will, the technology, I didn't understand it at the time. I was like, why does the technology date so back when we don't even use some of those? It's because the government still use some older operating systems and older technology. So your current operation, it says Windows 10, but we're on Windows 11, Windows 2016, Windows 2019. Those are just a few. And I'm not going to go over all of the features of these. While it's important, it's as you go through the course, more things will make sense. But I will touch on Unix and Linux. Unix and Linux are very similar to one another. Unix comes in many different forms. We call them flavors or distros, just like Linux. We call them distribution. You have the Berkeley software distribution, or BSD, and you have the Linux is an example of a System V for Release 4. Linux runs on any hardware. Some Linux versions will give you a GUI, but most you'll be working in what is called the Bourne shell, or the Born Again shell, or the C shell. I know I'm skimming through some of this, y'all. Just to show you, if you've never worked in Linux before, Linux interface looks similar to this. What is going on? So these are images of Linux interfaces. This is one right here of a Linux interface, and you would just enter your commands in that Linux interface. Scroll down. Here we go. This is a Linux interface here. And you would just type in commands. Once you learn it, you'll fall in love with it, and it'll become easier to manage as you go along. You have the Mac OS, which people don't realize Mac OS and Linux are very similar. Mac OS is built on a Darwin Unix, which is an open source Unix-like operating system, even though it's still proprietary. And proprietary just means that Mac or Apple, they own the code and they don't want anybody to have access to it. The hardware architecture needed to run in Mac OS is very dependent on the version of the OS. And if you're running the newest one, then you'll have all those features and functions of that. You have peer-to-peer networking, which has always been a standard of Mac OS. Mac OS is always meant to be a desktop operating system, even though we use it now in our cellular devices and tablets. Mac OS has been known for its support of graphics, and remember that Windows used to run inside of IBM computers as well, which later became Mac. I'm just going to keep on moving because some of this maybe a little dated. Here are some of the operating systems associated with Mac OS: Snow Leopard, Lion, Mountain Lion, Mavericks, Yosemite, El Capitan, and Sierra, and Mac OS High Sierra as well. You have Mojave, which is 10.14. You know, we are way further than that right now. We had Catalina as of 2019. All right. So, what is the main things to take away from chapter 2? That you have 40 years or more of of Microsoft operating systems. We got the GUI in Windows 95 because remember everything before was in the DOS screen, or what we refer to as command line. You had server operating systems that now had self-healing, NTFS, Active Directory. You have Unix-based operating systems such as Linux, which all of them really are Unix-based operating systems. And macOS is built on Darwin and open source. All right, and that was the wrap up for chapter 2. As always, I tell everyone, make sure that you go through your flashcards, understand your terminology and content that's associated with each chapter. All right, let's get into module 3, the CPU. I want to start off by showing you images of the CPU. Let me see. It is 9:47. Let's start off with images of a CPU. There are two types of CPUs. You have your LGA, which stands for Land Grid Array, and you have Pin Grid Array CPUs. So let's look at a couple images of the two. Any questions before we move forward? Does anybody have anything that they have questions about before I move on? If no questions, type no in the chat. If you do have questions, type yes. All right, I'm going to move on. So these are pin grid array CPUs, okay? What we call our central processing units, okay? And laptops, they can be soldered to the motherboard. Your pin grid array is a package that manufacturers mostly use to make processors solely, okay? You have pin grid array and you have land grid array. The LGA and PGA are different types of central processing units. And LGA's contact pins protrude from the motherboard's base. The CPU, on the other hand, features contact points to match those of the circuit board. And I know sometimes that is different. So let's watch a very quick video on the difference between PGA and LGA.
It doesn't matter what your goal is, making a resume, writing an essay, or drafting a cover letter, Grammarly takes your writing game.
The Master Keys series of mechanical keyboards from Cooler Master features
This is my guy. I love this channel, Paul's Hardware. Very good. He does a lot of building of PCs.
The thought occurred to me the other day that if you have just gotten into PC building within the past 5 years or so, and if you've gone with the prevailing recommendations based on performance and market share, that is to buy an Intel-based system, then you just might be a bit confused if you decide to put together a Ryzen-based computer now that AMD is back in the game. That's because Intel has used LGA, or Land Grid Array, CPU sockets since about 2004 with the introduction of the Pentium 4, whereas AMD continues to use PGA, or Pin Grid Array. Today we'll be exploring the pros and cons of both designs. The simplest way to describe both socket types is by indicating where the pins are. For LGA, the pins are on the motherboard, and the CPU itself has pads, gold-plated contact points that line up with the pins in the socket. Each pad makes contact with one pin so data or power can be transferred. For PGA, the pins are on the CPU, and rather than pads on the motherboard, there's a socket with holes that line up with the CPU pins. This is known as a zero insertion force socket, meaning that with the installation lever raised, the CPU should drop in easily without any pressure applied. The lever can then be dropped back into place to secure the CPU. Of course, there are other ways to surface mount a component onto a motherboard or PCB, and while I won't delve into older configurations like dual inline package, chip carrier, or the slot mounts that Pentium 2s and 3s used, I did want to quickly mention BGA, or Ball Grid Array. This is how CPUs and GPUs are usually installed in laptops and consoles, which aren't meant to be end-user serviceable. There's a similarity to PGA and LGA with BGA though, in that you have a specific number of contact points that need to hook up between the chip and the board. But Ball Grid Array uses tiny balls of solder or solder to preempt pronunciation police in the comments, instead of pins or pads that need to be aligned on the chip and then reflowed or heated up to the point where they melt and secure the chip to the board. This is usually done with specialized equipment, but I'll post a couple links in the description to videos of people who are crazy enough to do it at home. Needless to say, this is not recommended for most home builders, but now if you hear BGA, you'll know what that means too. So let's take a closer look at LGA, Land Grid Array, Intel's preferred socket. Intel's naming scheme is pretty straightforward. It's just LGA followed by the number of the pins in the motherboard sockets, or the number of pads on the CPU, which should be the same. So LGA 1151 has 1,151 contacts on the bottom, LGA 2011 has 2,011 contacts, and LGA 2011-3 also has 2011 contacts, but they changed the socket so it's not backwards compatible. We'll delve into backwards compatibility in a different video. Installing an LGA processor involves lifting a lever arm, or two lever arms in the case of Intel's Enthusiast platform. With the arm raised, the lid can lift up. The CPU can be aligned by referencing the tiny little gold triangle that's on the corner of the CPU as well as on the corner of the socket. Then the processor can be gently dropped in. The lid then goes back down, slips under a catch, and then the lever arm or arms can be pushed back down with a little bit of pressure to secure the CPU in the socket. It's not the simplest method, but it does get the job done. One of the big benefits of LGA, and I think this is actually why Intel changed over to it in the first place, is that it's much harder to damage the CPU itself. There are no pins to bend or break, and since the CPU is usually going to be the more expensive part, it does make some sense to transfer the more delicate parts of the interface to the motherboard, although motherboard manufacturers have probably been dealing with more RMAs since then. LGA motherboards, on the other hand, are incredibly delicate when it comes to the socket, and basically if you damage those pins, your motherboard is pretty much toast. Now, I've managed to repair LGA pins on a motherboard only once, and it was an X58 LGA 1366 board, and I had 3 identical boards with damaged sockets to work with. I managed to get only one working. The difficulty is mainly due to the socket pins themselves being smaller, flatter, and sort of angled as they come up out of the socket, so they have a little bit of give under pressure when the CPU is installed. I will say that I like LGA sockets for the ease of disassembly though, as the CPU is held very securely in the socket, which helps if you're working with an aftermarket cooler. Now AMD, for their part, has produced LGA CPUs in the past. Their Opteron line in 2006, for example, was LGA 1207, but by and large they've stuck with PGA for their consumer parts. AMD actually brands their PGA sockets with names such as AM3, FM2, and for Ryzen now, AM4, but they can still be identified by their pin counts. AM4, for example, could also be referred to as PGA 1331, but we'll stick with AM4 since it rolls off the tongue a little bit more easily. Installing a PGA CPU is quite simple, just to make sure to mind those pins on the CPU itself. You don't want to bend them or even touch them if you can possibly avoid it. The AM4 socket has a lever on one side that you just simply lift up, and then again you align the gold triangle that's on the corner of the CPU with the triangle that should be on the socket itself, and it should just drop right in. Again, this is a zero insertion force socket. Shirts, by the way, are available at my store via the link in the description, and that means that it should drop in with zero pressure. Drop the lever arm back down, and you're done. One of the great things about PGA is that the motherboard socket is much more durable. With no delicate pins on there, you don't even really need a cover for the socket like you do with LGA, which is pretty nice. The pins are on the CPU side though, and while they're not as delicate as LGA pins on a motherboard, they are exposed and they can be bent or even broken if handled improperly. My advice is to keep the CPU in its protective clamshell until you're ready to install it, and again, never try to force the CPU into a socket. Fortunately with PGA, a bent CPU pin, or even a few of them, is not the end of the world. I personally repaired probably at least 100 PGA CPUs with bent pins. This is back in my time when working in the Newegg RMA department, and some of them that were really, really bad. I basically just had to use a razor blade, steady hands, and lots of patience. Do this at your own risk, of course, and remember that if a pin breaks off, your CPU is toast. But it is certainly a lot more feasible than repairing a damaged LGA socket on a motherboard. Finally, when removing a PGA CPU, there's kind of a pain in the butt thing that can happen where the thermal paste sticks the CPU to the CPU cooler, and when you're pulling the CPU cooler off, you end up pulling the CPU out of the socket along with it without the lever arm raised. This happened to me, again, just recently, as well as Kyle when we were doing our Ryzen reviews, and while it's mostly not a big deal, I have seen people lose CPU pins when this happens. Just be careful when you're removing your cooler, and remember that it's easier to pull the cooler off while the thermal paste is still warm. So to sum up, I have 4 categories: ease of installation, CPU durability, motherboard durability, and ease of de-installation. PGA takes the lead for installation and motherboard durability, and LGA gets the win when it comes to CPU durability and de-installation. So both sockets have their pros and cons, and while other factors such as performance and features will probably weigh more heavily for you when deciding on what platform to build your next system on, hopefully this video has helped you learn a little bit more about the nuances between the two. That's all for this video though, so hit that like button if you enjoyed it, share with your friends.
That's fine. I just wanted you to see that. All right, let's get back to it. Okay. Activities. Nope. Review. All right. So let's get into that CPU. So we'll be talking about the features and functions of your CPU. Okay, your central processing unit. So we're going to talk about the functions and features. We're going to talk about the characteristics and the modern CPUs. Okay. Your CPU has what is called a system architecture. Okay. This includes the number and type of CPUs and the hardware, the communication routes, or what we call buses. Buses are major wires or pathways that lead up to a central device. So let's do the CPU bus and an image of the CPU bus. So if we were looking at a motherboard, right? Just here's one right here, a bus. So there are a lot of wires and pathways that will lead up. These here are expansion buses, but we can add expansion cards, okay? And with this expansion bus, you have major wires that lead there. Kind of think of it like a city. If you go to the mayor's office, there are a lot of roads that lead to the mayor's office or that area, you know, going down to the main post office in the city, okay? So there's a lot of pathways that lead there. So that's what we refer to when we're talking about a bus. So this image right here that I'm about to show you shows what a system bus looks like. So you have these major wires, and these major wires, you have a lot of devices that are connected to them, kind of like arteries that lead to the heart, okay? So this is what we are referring to when we're talking about a bus. We're also talking about wires and pathways that will lead to a particular device. Here it says a computer is made of different components such as your memory, your ALU, registers, etc. Each component should be able to communicate with other for proper execution of instructions and information, the flow of information. If we try to implement a mesh topology, which we have not talked about, mesh is when you have a group of wireless and wired devices connected together. You're going to have different components. So with those different components, you need a bus. And here you have a data bus that data will flow through, an address bus that your address information. Now, when we talk about address information, we're talking about the metadata for messages, the metadata for devices when they're sending information. Like this is coming from the memory. This is coming from your input output chip. This is coming from a number of different components. So you'll have different address buses for programs and things of that nature. That memory, input output, CPU, they're going to read those messages as they're coming through. And you have your control bus as well. What is a data bus? We'll get into that later, but we'll talk about that in a minute, not right now. I just kind of wanted to go over some of those terms before we really get into the thick of what we're covering today. So with the CPU, you have the chip that does what is called calculations. Here it says computational and logic work. The processor can either be a single or a multiprocessor, depending on what is offered based upon the chipset of that particular computer. You have your processor core, which is part of the CPU that reads and executes machine code. A multi-core processor has 2 or more cores. So let me show that very quickly. Single core versus multi-core. And then we'll take a look at the images. Cores versus threads. Let's do this. Oh, no, that was the perfect image. Right here. All right, so you're going to have a single core CPU. And with the single core CPU, you're going to get, maybe certain programs that are running at a time. What is this? All right. With that, you're going to have a single core with your CPU. You have a number of registers and cache. Cache is memory that is held that helps the CPU work faster. So that's why sometimes if your computer or your internet or something is working sluggish, it's best to delete your browser cache so that you can access things better. So if I was to define cache is what helps us. It's for productivity. So whenever you type A and you get a list of items, that's your cache working, that the CPU doesn't have to run back to the hard drive and your CPU doesn't have to go to the memory in order to grab or access information. You have memory inside of the CPU. If I was to type B, that's going to give me things that I would, access immediately. Even if you go to Files Explorer, if you click on Files Explorer and open up Files Explorer and you scroll up to the top, these areas right here are going to be the things that you choose the most, and that's going to be associated with cache as well. So I access these folders the most, and when I access these folders, the operating system is going to, and the CPU is going to store this in cache because it knows that I go there the most. It's to help you with productivity. All right. So that's what we're referring to when we're talking about that. And then you have your bus, your CPU bus, which supports memory as well as input-output processing. So you can have one core or you can have multiple cores. And if you have multiple cores, it's like having multiple processors at the same time. Okay. So that's where another feature of a CPU is multiprocessing. All right. So multiprocessor computers have multiple physical CPU chips. Many server computers and high-end client computers are multiprocessor computers. CPU startup operations. When power is applied to the CPU, it begins reading data from a memory address called a reset vector. The reset vector is an address that a CPU begins reading from whenever the CPU receives a reset signal. Okay, so it's just a file that it reads. You have program clusters. A program counter is a register on a CPU that contains the address of the next instruction the CPU will execute. It's kind of like timing. Like at this time, a particular feature is going to take place, and then once that program counter is done, then another program will execute after that, or a CPU instruction. Let me say it that way. It says, what is the part of the CPU that is responsible for reading and executing machine code? I'll move forward. It is the core. The core executes machine code. Now, there are different aspects of CPU design. We have the control unit, which provides timing and coordination between other parts of the CPU. We have the arithmetic logic unit, or the ALU, performs the primary task of executing instructions. We have registers, temporary holding locations where data must be placed before the CPU can use it. So it'll hold on to data and then use it. You have your memory or your cache controller, which is what we just talked about. The cache controller intercepts access to memory for data or code and checks if the request data is in cache first. So that's what we're doing. So when we do functions like this and I type A, it's going into the cache register and it's trying to see if it's actually there. So you have registers and you have memory and the cache controller. All right. That's why I said some of the terminology is, very important. We looked at what a bus is, major pathways and wires that lead up to a central device. So a series of what is called lanes or wires used to communicate between CPU. And when I say wires, sometimes that's like a virtual concept. Lanes could all be the pins on the bottom of a expansion card. Okay. There are three types of buses. A controller bus or control bus carries status signals between the CPU and other devices. The address bus, which carries address signals to indicate where data should be. Now, I know that I'm talking about these things, and sometimes when we talk about it, it's hard to visualize it. So what I recommend that you do, if you have any extra cash or you have a desktop laying around or you got a friend that has a computer that they're not using, ask them, can you have it? Tell them to take the hard drive out because you don't want their personal records. But grab the computer, go get a tool set from Micro Center or, computer departments in Target and Walmart, or go to your local computer store and experiment with the computers. You'll be like, well, what does this have to do with cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is knowing every aspect of the network. Let's think about relationships, because remember, computers mimic humans. If you don't understand the physical, the psychological aspect of a person, how can you better be with a mate? You know what I mean? Or have a spouse, or even friendships and relationships. If you don't know how a person's mannerisms and their actions and their thought processes, what kind of friend are you? Okay? Because the goal is to establish a relationship so that you can have the best communication. So you got to know how people think. So this is similar in this aspect where you have the control bus and it carries signals between the CPU and other devices. Okay. You have the address bus, which carries address signals to indicate where data should be read or written into the system's memory. Then you have a data bus. Now, we say address bus, we're talking about hard drives, we're talking about memory, we're talking about a file that lets us know, or address information, metadata, that let us know where this information came from. Then you have a data bus, which carries the actual data that is being read from or written to system memory. Okay. So the control bus that controls the signals. You have an address bus that gives location information, and then you have a data bus that carries the actual message. All right. And this is a similar image, which is similar to the one that I had here, where you have your core of the CPU. You have I'll make that larger so that everyone can see. Get rid of this. You have your core, you have your registers, you have your cache, your bus, your memory, and your input, output, or messages or communications that are going to take place. Let me get rid of some of this. All right. So what do CPUs, or what are they comprised of? You have the architecture, the clock speed. The clock speed is similar to your heartbeat. So devices have a heartbeat. We call it a clock speed. You have your cache, your address bus, your data bus, your control bus, and your CPU scheduling. So you have like a scheduler that's going to look at the time that certain processes take place. And then after a certain time, if that process is not finished, it's going to move it to the hard drive from RAM to the hard drive, take stuff off hard drive and move it back. We call that swapping. Okay. When it comes to the CPU, you have two types of designs. You have your CISC, which is your complex instruction set computing, and you have your RISC, which is your reduced instruction set computing. And it's just the number of chips or the number of instructions that can be processed. That's the difference. Complex, more processes; reduced, less processes or calculations that will be processed on that chip. And we refer to that as an instruction set. The difference between those is the clock cycling, the pipelining, which is the ability of the CPU to perform more than one task on a single clock cycle. Do I have time to go into a clock? Yeah. All right. Let's go into clock cycles. Cycles explained in our CPU. I always try to find something visual. Is everything going cool? Is it kind of clear? Give a yay or a nay. As we're going through these terms and terminology, I don't like for it to be so one-sided. If it's confusing, let me know. All right. So here's what is a CPU clock cycle. The basic unit of time within a central processing unit representing a single completion operation that the CPU performs. If you're into science, think of it like the brain, okay? The brain manages everything. It manages your pleasure, it manages your temperature, it manages your functions, and it manages your electric system, it manages using the bathroom, it manages all the different systems. How you take in light, how you don't take in light via the eyes, how you hear, it takes in all those things. So, and all that is according to time, because you're going to need certain functions to operate. So think about when you think about your cell phone, when you're tired, you can't do certain things. Your eyes may feel dreary. It may be hard to see because now your brain has said, okay, I need to allocate resources to other parts of the body. It's the end of the day, maybe time for digestion. Your body's getting tired. Your body's telling you, I need sleep. Our electronic devices do the same thing. They'll shift resources to other places to when the battery's getting low or if another program needs more resources. That's probably it. Oh. Okay. So if that's the case, it does representing a single complete operation the CPU performs, fetching instructions, decoding them, executing operations as well. Let's get into some videos associated with the clock cycle. I'm going to try this first one right here, Max's Tech. Got to start making my own videos. I can get rid of these introductions.
Welcome all to yet another Explain video. Today we are going to be discussing CPU clock speeds, or otherwise known as clock rates, or CPU frequency. As usual, we will start with the basics. A CPU clock speed is a measure of how many clock cycles a CPU can perform in 1 second. We measure it in hertz. And for those of you who do not know, hertz is a common measurement we use for waves, and it is 1 cycle per second. Now, in modern CPUs, we measure this in gigahertz, which is 1 billion hertz. So a CPU that runs for, say, 4 gigahertz can perform 4 billion clock cycles in 1 second. But you're probably already asking, well, then what is a clock cycle? I'm glad you asked. A clock cycle, or simply a cycle, is a single electrical pulse in a CPU. During this electrical pulse, the CPU can perform a basic task, like accessing memory, writing data, or just grabbing a new set of instructions to perform. Not all tasks the CPU has to do are equal though. Some instructions require more cycles from the CPU to be completed. Depending on the architecture of the CPU, the clock speed can be more or less important. In the end, what's important is how many of these instructions can be completed. The clock speed of your CPU is a very important factor when it comes to the CPU speed, but it is not the ultimate decision maker. Some CPUs can actually perform faster at slower clock speeds just due to the nature of how they process information. Some processors' architecture focuses on high clock speeds with fewer instructions per cycle, while others have slower clock speeds with more instructions per cycle, both of which have their limitations and benefits. But how do we arrive at the clock speed you see on your computer? The advertised clock speed is a multiple of the base clock, which is set by your motherboard's chipset, and the CPU multiplier. For example, if you have a typical 100 MHz base clock and a CPU multiplier of 35, you would have 100 MHz times 35, which is 3500 MHz, or 3.5 GHz as your clock speed. The base clock is used for more than just your processor though. This base clock is used with your RAM, graphics card, and pretty much any other chip running on your computer to ensure they are all synced up with the CPU so the information can be processed properly and in the correct sequence. Now we can't discuss clock speed without mentioning overclocking. Overclocking is what you can do to raise the CPU's clock speed higher than the manufacturer has set it. The default speed is set at a point that is verified to be stable according to whoever developed the chip. As you raise the clock speed though, you'll run into stability issues where your PC might just crash. This can happen when you have told the CPU to run faster without giving it enough power to do so. So with overclocking comes overvolting as well. Overvolting is when you raise the voltage given to the chip in order to run at these higher clock speeds. But this comes with its own dangers since more voltage means more heat. And so begins the dance of dialing in the most stable clock speed at the lowest voltage possible while remaining stable and not crashing for overheating. I will make a separate video going more in depth on that, so make sure you are subscribed because a ton of you actually are not. And that is pretty much it when it comes to
Oh man, I was doing all that talking and didn't realize I was muted. Let me go back. All right. So my question was, thank you, Tola Lupe. I truly appreciate that. So when we talk about clock cycles, We're just saying that you can have a certain amount of tasks that can take place within a particular clock cycle. Okay. This leads us into what is called double data rate. So think about it. My analogy was that I was saying, compare it to your heartbeat. Okay. Your heartbeat beats 2 times. Do, do. So you have double the data you have double the electronic pulses, double the blood flow, double the resources, double the energy that's moving with each heartbeat. That's similar to the computer. Like I said, everything imitates human life. So your computer has these electric pulses that sends data and electricity at the same time of the pulse. And when we say double, you have single data rate, which will be 1 clock cycle. Then you have double data rate, which will be 2 cycles of data and 1 clock cycle. Okay. And as we move up in RAM, double data rate DDR2, DDR3, DDR4, DDR5, that clock rate gets faster and faster and faster. Okay. Then we have microcode, a small program inside the chip that interprets and executes each instruction. Programming. So here what I was explaining was the same thing that I said before. Your complex instruction set computing has, as you can see here, each number represents a cycle, okay, a clock cycle. And then you have data that can move in each clock cycle. How much data can you move in a particular clock cycle? Here you have 4 cycles in one instance of data being moved. So this would be like DDR4. If it was just 1, that would be single data rate. Now you have, if it was 2, double data rate, 3, DDR3, 4, DDR4. Okay. So that's kind of the explanation of that. But really, we're talking about the CPU and how the CPU handles the clock cycle and how much information it can process in a particular clock cycle. So it says 3 additions in 12 clock cycles. That's what it's saying there. And then here you have 3 additions in 6 clock cycles. You have less instructions inside the RISC. Okay. So you also have a compiler, which is a computer program that takes a high level of language and turns it into assembly code that is executed by the CPU. Think of it as a assembly line that you have all of this data that will come into the CPU, and then certain code will get executed. It says an assembler turns those instructions into numeric values called opcodes. I know rappers will be like, opcodes. Anyway, number and usage of registers. You have your CISC CPU, which has fewer registers than the RISC CPU. So as you can see here, you can load more on the different clock cycles because it has more registers. But that was pipelining. All right. And this is what we're referring to here, high level language to machine code. As you get the language is C++, C++ in the compiler. Wish it could be larger. All right. And then it says assembly file produced by the compiler. So this is the file that was produced by the compiler. Then you have the assembler for Intel CPUs. And then after that, the executable file contains machine code ready for the CPU execution. So the assembler will send the information and execute that particular code. The main takeaways that I want you to get from this is what are the different types of CPUs, the importance of understanding clock speed, understanding cache, understanding registers. You really just want to understand the importance of the CPU and what the CPU does. This is kind of like not overglorified, but it's more akin to a help desk class and things that you would have to understand. But this information prepares you in cyber defense, because if I understand how things operate, when a malicious code comes in or hackers in the network, I can say something's wrong with how that device is functioning. And this is what we refer to as an indicator of compromise. Okay. Here it says the internal clock speed is the speed at which the CPU executes an instruction or part of an instruction. The faster the clock speed, the faster the CPU. My analogy I always give the students is that my father worked on cars, so he knew how to, when you had carburetors inside of a car, he knew how to adjust the carburetor so that more gas would go through the carburetor, which in turn made the car run faster. So he knew how to adjust that. As more components are needed to make a CPU, the chip uses more energy, which is converted to heat. This is why on Paul's Hardware, the video, the gentleman said, yeah, but when you speed that CPU up, it's going to get hotter. So you have to have a good cooling unit for that CPU. That's like when you start, you're cool when you're sitting, but if you start running, or if you had a heart issue, or at a certain point, women get to a certain point where their body heat kicks up more, then you're going to feel what's going on. Even when you're sick and your body's trying to heal itself, more processes are taking place. So your body starts to generate more heat. So you have to find ways to cool it down. So the same thing takes place in our computer systems. The external clock speed runs slower than the internal clock speed. The external clock speed is typically 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/8 the speed of the internal CPU, because you have external clock speeds as well. You have your cache memory, which we talked about before. It's already inside of the CPU. It holds some of our resources or access to things that we access the most to help us with productivity. And it says here, while the CPU is executing program code, instructions or data that are most likely to be used next are fetched from main memory, your RAM chip, and placed in cache memory. Okay, so it's to help with productivity. It knows if I type Y, YouTube might be the first thing on the list. As you can see, I go there the most, YouTube. So it helps me get there. When teaching on my computer, if I was to type V, that's why you see Vital Source there. V. I do a lot of on my music page, I do a lot of interviews. So I use this tool here. So Video Ninja is there. But this is the cache memory working, so it can help you be more productive and get things faster. You have different levels of cache: L1 cache, L2, L3, L4. This is determined by the motherboard and the CPU. Okay. If you get a motherboard that takes a certain amount of cache, your CPU has to match the motherboard. So you have L1 cache, which is the fastest. It's a smaller space. L2 is slower than L1, but larger in size, but not as big as L3. L3, until the last several years, was not part of the CPU, but part of the motherboard. Now it's part of the CPU. You have L4 cache, which is usually found on the motherboard if it exists. That's why I say your motherboard and your CPU have to match. The cache controller predicts what data will be needed and makes the data available in cache before it is needed. So if I come here, cache is going to work because I'm going to type in, let's see, OBS. I'll type O, and it immediately finds OBS for me. That's cache working right there to help with productivity and searches. Your address bus is an internal communications pathway that specifies the source and the target address for memory reads and writes. Everything has to be visual, so let's go here. All right. The computer component that sends the location data of other parts of a computer. Think about it like an envelope, or think about it like you're going somewhere in your cell phone. Think about GPS and Life 360. They're locating your metadata based upon coordinates. Here's something I want to draw a comparison on. If you understand GPS, that you have 4 satellites that come together to create location information. One is about imaging, one is about like a flat surface metadata, one is about the actual pinpoints of the location, and I forgot what the other one is, but it's 4 satellites together that determine what we see when we pull up GPS devices. So your hard drive is very similar to that, UEFI. That when you use UEFI, the computer is going to use a file and location information to figure out where files are located. Your BIOS is the same way. So when your computer starts, this is why I wanted you to understand the booting process. Because when you hit the power button, that is when a signal is sent to the hard drive and it looks for a file that kind of gives you an overview of what the hard drive has on it, and then it locates and finds the operating system and associated programs. But one is going to look for a file with old metadata. One is going to look for bit mapping location information. So I want you to build upon that to understand that as well, because the importance of it is if programs can change the BIOS chip, then hackers know that they could put instructions in that can change the BIOS chip to gather information, especially if they can stop your operating system for a while and gain access to your computer. Cyber defense. This is where this correlates and begins to make a little more sense. So I want to go to a video that kind of talks about it. You see, this is what Mr. Helton does. Let's see, that's 14 minutes. I'm not trying to do that. System bus, address data control. Okay, let's go to this one.
So the term system bus is a term where you're referring to all three of the other buses together. Okay, so you've got three buses. You've got data bus, address bus, and control bus, that you'll start to learn what the differences are between those and how that they're used by the processor. But the system bus as a term is just the term for all three buses together. They're known as the system bus. Okay, so you've got a data bus. The data bus transports data, funnily enough, and instructions between components on the motherboard. And it's bi-directional, so data bus can send data in both ways, to and from the processor. So the data bus, all these buses, just in case I haven't mentioned it, are just basically wires. They're like certain tracks on a circuit that can send electrical current data down. Okay, so data bus, those ones and zeros that travel down that are data, and it can go in both directions. You've got the address bus, which is single directional, which sends address signals from the CPU to memory. These address signals contain specific addresses, so when it wants an instruction, it will send the address of that instruction or data, send the address of the data to memory, but it only goes one way. It goes from the CPU out. You've then got the control bus. This is bi-directional, so it sends control signals between components. So examples of control signals include things like interrupt requests, which we've kind of previously mentioned in some other videos, clock timings, which we've not actually mentioned the clock yet, but it will be mentioned in lots of videos. And the control bus is bi-directional. Now, that's them as a concept. If we look at a three-box model to try and help us understand how these work. So you've got in your three-box model, you've got your CPU, main memory, which is your ROM and your RAM, and your I/O controllers. Your I/O controller is any input-output device. Okay, so your secondary storage, your main memory, your big hard drive will be I/O. Your keyboard, mouse, monitors, all I/O, printers, etc. So what happens is your CPU might be sending data between these components. You see, it's bi-directional. Okay, but it might also be receiving data from these. So you think a keyboard might send letters to the CPU, okay, to process. So you see that's really important that that's bi-directional. The address bus, however, if the CPU wants to send an address to main memory or the I/O controller or your hard drive, etc., if it sends an address, these devices will respond with the data from that address. Okay, but you can see how that's only one directional. So if you imagine, if the main memory receives an address, the stuff that's in that address won't go back via the address bus, it'll go via the data bus because it's data. Whether it's an instruction or data, it goes on the data bus. So you can see why that's one directional. And finally, you've got the bi-directional control bus. So that's for all the control signals. So for the CPU to tell devices what it wants it to do. You can see they might send control signals. So an example of a control signal, a simple one, would be if I send an address to main memory, I also need to send a control signal. Because if the main memory just receives an address on its own, it doesn't know what to do with it. Whereas if I send a control signal saying read or write, if it receives an address and a write down the control bus, it knows, oh, I'm writing to that address, whatever's in the data bus. If it's read, then I need to get what's in that address and send it down the data bus. Okay. Alternatively, for them to come in the other way, you might have to interrupt the CPU doing what it's currently doing, which is a signal down the control bus to the CPU. So you can see why, again, this is bi-directional. Hopefully the 3-box model helps you understand the buses a little bit better.
Any questions? I thought that was a pretty good video, but I have a different vantage of understanding in terms of the address, data bus, and control bus. Two comments. Oh, everybody said no. Okay, good. All right. So, okay. So the address bus typically runs at the external clock speed of the CPU. So you have the internal CPU's clock speed, then you have the system clock speed, which is kind of regulated by RAM. Okay. So the RAM can have a faster clock speed than the CPU. Typically, that's what you want if you want to overclock. You want your heart to be able to take the pressure that your brain's telling it to. So when you start running, you pump more blood because now the heart can handle that because the brain is saying, let's run faster, but you're going to heat up more, so you're going to sweat more. Okay. Similar to computer processing. All right. The width of the address bus is the number of bits that can be used in the address memory. And we know what bits are, right? We understand what bits are, class? If you do, can you tell me what a bit is? Got a response? 2 responses. Good. It's a binary digit. It's the smallest unit of data. It's either a 1 or a 0. So it's a binary. So a bit, or thank you, a binary digit. Yep. So when we talk about binary, that's what it would say in here. Either a 1 or 0 messages are traveling through this information. So the color red, let me see, just do this. The color red in binary. What is the... So this is the color red, and this is what the computer reads. Oh, man. So this is 128. It says the binary, the color red is represented as 111111110000. Okay. It says where the first set of 8 bits, all ones, represent the maximum value for red. And the following 2 sets of 8 bits, all zeros, represent no green or no blue, because you got RGB. RGB, is what it's going to be. And then if they're different colors, you're going to get different variations of these binary numbers. That's why I said this is logic. They use a logic. 1 represents true, 0 represents false, 1 represents power flowing through a circuit, 0 represents no power through a circuit. So if your lights are off, everything's at 0. If the lights are on, everything is at 1. If you're telling the truth, 1. If you're lying, 0. It's based off logic. 2, if someone's telling the truth, 2 people, you have a true. If 2 people and 1 is lying, you have 1 0 or 0 1. It's a false. Okay, so that's where they're going with the RGBs and how it's set up in binary. All right. And everything, letters, characters, everything is what the computer reads, basic computer language. All right, moving on. We talked about the data bus, so I'm not going to stay on those. We introduced interrupt requests last time, And remember, when we're talking about cooperative and preemptive operating systems, we said an interrupt request is when a program sends a signal to pin 1 on the CPU, and the CPU then tells the operating system there's something going on, there's an interrupt, and we need to take care of it. Maybe there's more resources that are needed. Maybe a program needs to shut other programs down because it needs to take over because i.e. the user has requested certain things to happen. An interrupt request is a request to the processor to interrupt whatever it is doing to take care of a process, which in turn might be interrupted by another process. Some aspects of computing are multi-threading, and a thread is the ability to run 2 or more processes known as threads, and a thread is the smallest piece of computer code that can be independently scheduled for execution. Hyperthreading allows 2 threads to run on each CPU core simultaneously. So you can have one core, multiple threads running in it. That's hyperthreading. Multi-threading is the ability to run 2 or more processes at the same time. So you can multi-thread, a thread, smallest piece of computer code. So when you are playing that video game, you're not playing the whole video game. The video game is being threaded. Just like when you're watching a movie or you're downloading something, you don't immediately download the whole program. You download pieces of the program until the whole program is finished. Okay. If it's unclear, I'll show a video. Multi-threading explained video. That's 6 minutes. Can we do this? All right. Yep, that's a good one. I like this video. Let's do it.
Whatever you do it for less. At Harbor Freight.
Start investing in these companies. All right.
Atera is the IT painkiller. Remote monitoring and management, remote access, help desk and ticketing.
Hello folks. Today I want to talk to you about multi-threading. At a very high level, I'm going to go over what it is and why we want to use it. I wanted to create a video on multi-threading because if you're new to the concept of multi-threading, it sounds really scary. In reality, multi-threading is a very practical and straightforward concept. In short, multi-threading enables us to do parallel computing efficiently. Let's start our explanation of multi-threading by first discussing how a process works. When you start a program, it is first loaded and given an address space in main memory from your hard disk. After being loaded in memory, it is then scheduled onto an available CPU. When a process is scheduled onto a CPU, the process instructions are executed sequentially. Take for example this simple program which prints out "Hello World" to the console. When we run this program, the CPU will execute each line of the program sequentially, and it will keep track of which instruction it is about to execute by using what's known as a program counter. The program counter represents part of an execution context. An execution context is the current state of a running process, which includes data like what instruction the CPU is currently executing. If you have multiple CPUs, and even in the case of a single CPU, you could have multiple execution contexts within a single process. We refer to these execution contexts in an abstract data structure called a thread. A process can have one or more threads. These threads can execute simultaneously on multiprocessor and multi-core systems and execute different sections of the program. In contrast to a thread, a process is allocated an address space. In the case of a thread shares its parent process's address space along with any other threads that the parent process has created. In this way, threads are considered a lightweight option to a process because they will almost always consume less memory than a new process would. In this diagram, we see that process 2 has several threads. there is also a variable x that process 2 created. All 3 of the threads in process 2 have the ability to read and write to the memory location where variable x is located. If variable x were to be incremented every time we completed a for loop iteration within process 2, there's a possibility that each of these threads may increment the variable. As the programmer, we have no control over which thread accesses variable x and when it accesses variable x. The reason for this is that the operating system scheduler schedules processes and threads according to its scheduling algorithm. Whatever scheduling algorithm is on our operating system, that's what we have to use. This can cause really nasty issues in multi-threaded programs. In order to implement multi-threaded programs, we almost certainly have to use what's known as a synchronization construct. There are many, but some of the most common are mutexes and semaphores. These mechanisms enforce synchronization between threads. So if thread 1 in process 2 is currently updating variable x with a new value, no other threads will be allowed to update variable x while thread 1 is updating it. I said earlier,
I'm going to stop here because the main thing I wanted you to see was this right here, where you can see one thread in an address space and you can see multiple threads taking place. That means you got 3 different programs running in one core, okay? Or multiple cores depending on the CPU and the motherboard, all right? That's the main thing I wanted to highlight and focus on. All right, it is 10:55, and in giving everyone an opportunity to have enough time to respond to the summary question, what I've done here is I've added the summary question to module 3. Here's the end of class summary, and you now have from now to the end of class to complete that particular summary. Okay. I did different than that. I gave you till the end of today to respond. I didn't put a time limit on it, but I'm expecting it to be done by the end of today. So you have the end of class summary. Are there any questions that anyone may have? Now, remember, we stopped on slide 25, and we have 35 slides to go. So I can wrap that. Really, it's just that goes to 33.
We stopped on slide 25.
Yes, we stopped on slide 25.
Okay.
And then 2 of those slides are knowledge checks. So while you're doing that, I can go ahead and
I do, however, have a question.
go right ahead.
Why do we only have 2 homeworks rather than like 4 or 5 like we usually get?
Because that's just what this the CPU is like. It's focusing on a component that you can explain easily. Operating systems take a lot to explain. There are different operating systems, more components. Typically, the main thing with the CPU, you have multi-threading, multi-processing, functions and features, the different types, whether it's an Intel or an AMD. As you can tell, they haven't gotten to the M1 chip yet because now there are 3 processors out there. Even though they didn't even bring up ARM, which is, AMD or ARD. I'm sorry. ARM is more associated with Linux, but it's not really but we'll get into that a little later. So that's why this chapter isn't long as the others.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you don't have as many activities that you would with that one. Someone else asked a question, said not at this time. Okay. So what I'm going to do, since I have just opened it up, I'll just leave an announcement to let everyone know to please complete this by the end of today. Once this video processes, I should chop it up, but I'm going to go ahead and put it up so that everyone will have access to it as well. Okay. And if there aren't any other questions, ladies and gentlemen, class is dismissed. Let me stop the recording.
When is the text box thing due? The paragraph?
By the end of today.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. That's what I was just saying. Everyone, you can. Yeah, I've given everybody more, as opposed to just because I'm just gonna leave it open, and I'll put an announcement in the classroom. I just refresh my page.
Okay.
I don't see the class activity. Give me a second. I will show it to you. Let's go to share. All right. So if you're here, and I'll do it as a student. You as a student. Gotta get rid of all this. My computer's starting to run sluggishly. All right. So if you go down to module 3, see right here where it says end of highlighted right there, 2/25/2025 end of class summary.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, due today.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right, let me leave out of that. So it's in module 3. So on our next class meeting, I will wrap up and then go into module 4. So we'll get a jump on activities from next week. Bum, 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 No, what was I getting ready to do? Okay, no problem. Yeah, oh, that's what I was when I was going to put the date in. The due date. Edit. Will be due later this evening. All right, everyone. You have a great one, and I will see you on Thursday.